What keeps a deception going, after the initial messages are accepted as genuine, is the gradual development of a tacit relationship between the deceiver and the deceived, based on a powerful coincidence of interest both parties have. As the KGB demonstrated in foisting Yushchenko on the CIA, the deceiver needs to retain his mark's confidence. He also has a direct interest in helping the mark enhance his own stature in the eyes of his superiors and his allied intelligence services, since that will improve the chances of the deception succeeding. The deceived, in turn, benefits from his access to the apparently valuable information that his source is providing him, if it does not become suspect. He has therefore a direct interest in protecting the reputation of his deceiver, as the CIA had with Yushchenko. The more money he pays his deceiver, and the more information he vouches for to his superiors as genuine, the commensurately greater stake the mark has in protecting the bona fides of his deceiver. Moreover, the deceiving deceiver often must work closely together to protect the secrecy of this relationship. They must arrange secret meeting places, code words, recognition signals, and other conspiratorial exchanges, as in an illicit love affair. The very act of collaborating to arrange these liaisons tends to further heighten their mutual involvement. The more the mark becomes enmeshed in the conspiracy, the greater is his need to trust his deceiver. This collaboration may even reach the point where the mark is forced to become the defender of his own deceiver, lest he open himself up to the charge of being a dupe. In many instances, the deceived tells the deceiver which elements of his story are suspect, and what further evidence he must supply to convince others of his legitimacy. Soviet intelligence, on the other hand, succeeded in recruiting and running agents in virtually every strata of American activity of interest to it. The moles who have been uncovered in the United States have been, aside from intelligence officers and diplomats, nuclear scientists, rocket technology experts, defense systems engineers, cryptographers, telemetry analysts, congressional staff members, economists, mathematicians, archivists, translators, anti-submarine warfare experts, medical researchers, journalists, computer operators, and business executives. These differences appear to proceed not from any lack of sophistication or skill in the CIA but from fundamental distinctions between open and closed societies. It was what one think tank analyst at the Deception Conference referred to as the asymmetries. To begin with, the Soviet Union does not need to rely on either its espionage service or its satellites for basic intelligence about the state of mind of the American political leaders, debates over US national security policies, or the technological developments they depend on. It can openly garner such material from newspapers that keep close contact with the elites, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, television programs, such as the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour and ABC's Nightline, on which policymakers debate each other, trade publications like Aviation Week, in which defense contractors vie with one another to release information about their projects, and congressional reports and debates, which spell out priorities in policy. To supplement and test these data, Soviet bloc diplomats, journalists, and other researchers in the United States can use public libraries, archives, and university services such as university microfilms to obtain on microfilm reference books, PhD theses, telephone directories, scientific treatises, and government data released on prior Freedom of Information Act requests. Soviet intelligence can also, for the price of a computer search, consult databases such as Lexis, Nexus, and Facts on File. It can take advantage of UN research facilities, which interconnect with most economic databases, or even make its own Freedom of Information Act requests. Not surprisingly, Eastern Bloc countries make a vast number of such requests. In addition, it can send observers to almost all government hearings, which are by law open to the public, and whereas its own officials are restricted, it can often acquire the insights from zealous investigations of American journalists, congressional staff members, and special prosecutors, not to mention defectors from the bureaucracy who go public in books, magazines, and Senate hearings because of their objections to policies. Aside from the plethora of information available in the public domain, Soviet intelligence systematically intercepts telephone conversations of Americans it is interested in, through means that are both legal and internationally acceptable. It can use, for example, antennae on its embassy in Washington, D.C., which, after all, is not subject to US laws, or its antennae in Cuba, which pick up all transatlantic satellite calls, or its satellites in space, which are sanctified as national technical means by the SALT Treaty. These interceptions are effective for two reasons. First, unlike the Soviet Union, the telephone is universally used in the United States, and virtually all targets of Soviet intelligence make and receive calls. Second, dialing is now mainly computerized, which makes it relatively easy to distinguish phone calls made to selected numbers such as the office or home number of policymakers, congressional staffs, Defense Department employees, defense contractors, scientists, or lobbyists. And, unlike the Soviet Union, telephone books are readily available. Soviet diplomats can even buy mailing and telephone lists of government employees from American market research services. This ubiquitous telephone vulnerability means that even Americans who avoid leaking to the press or testifying before Congress can be listened to by Soviet intelligence. The extraordinary mobility of employment in the United States, even for those holding classified secrets, makes it exceedingly difficult to control this leakage of information. The rapid movement of technicians, lawyers, and academics back and forth between the private and public sectors renders it virtually impossible to segregate telephone users, and when government officials move into the private sphere, they cannot be compelled to speak over scrambled telephones, nor, since there is no official Secrets Act, can ex-officials be prevented from revealing secrets to journalists preparing books or, with the exception of CIA employees, from writing their own memoirs. Even when an employee leaves a job in which he has access to secrets and moves to another position, he still may hear echoes about the project from friends and acquaintances, which he may pass on to others. The huge consultant industry in Washington, which has had its share of corruption, is based on ex-employees having informal access to important information about American defense policy. Just as corporations buy such insights by retaining consultants, so can Soviet intelligence through false flag companies. American deception planners, to be sure, could use these public channels for disinformation by planting and orchestrating fake stories in news media, congressional testimony, biographic disclosures, and even phone conversations. But this possibility is severely mitigated by the sanctions and opprobrium that arise from government attempts to manipulate the American media. The concern that limits government actions is not the disinformation, which may be an acceptable objective, but the blowback when it is reported by American news organizations. When, for example, the Reagan White House planned to use this information to undermine Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi, career civil servants and military officers immediately assessed the risk in terms of their own careers. Lieutenant General John H. Mullering, representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, protested that the use of this disinformation could be exposed. He asked, what if the memorandum ever got out? As it turned out, the plan was leaked to the Woodward of the Washington Post, presumably by the Middle East experts at the CIA and Pentagon who were aghast, as Woodward reports, at the prospect that the disinformation would blow back to the American media. When he published the story on the front page, the media were predictably outraged, and the careers of those involved were permanently stained. The lesson was that disinformation is a very dangerous enterprise. No one could be sure that enemies or rivals in the present or future administration would not leak a plan. For many in the American bureaucracy, the risk of exposure outweighs any advantage. While Soviet intelligence cannot totally discount the possibility of disinformation being inserted into public channels, it can reckon that this is done only in rare circumstances given the penalties imposed on it by the American media, whereas the United States must use its intelligence resources to piece together a mosaic about Soviet intentions. The Soviet Union, which has illicit access to the vast public realm of data about America and its allies, can concentrate all its espionage energies on penetrating the few compartments that still remain sealed.